The breakup of the Beatles was a bittersweet event. Resentment and animosity had been building up for some time. The band's ties were tested in the late 1960s as they struggled with creative disagreements. When they decided to quit touring in 1966, they put all of their energy into making songs in the studio. The album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in 1967, marked the beginning of this new direction and beautifully captured the essence of that year's Summer of Love. But there was a lot of friction during the making of their following album, the White Album. As tensions rose among the Beatles, Ringo Starr felt compelled to briefly depart the group. "There was a lot of friction during that album," Paul McCartney said, looking back on that time. Even the thought of breaking up was stressful. John Lennon subsequently agreed, saying, "The breakup of the Beatles can be heard on that album." John told Paul, George Harrison, and Ringo that he wanted a divorce from the Beatles in September 1969, after the majority of the recording for Abbey Road and Let It Be, the Get Back sessions, had been finished. After this, Paul decided the Beatles were over and went into hiding to create McCartney, his first solo album. The band later reached out to John again, this time asking for his help finishing Let It Be, which would serve as a soundtrack to the upcoming Get Back film. Paul returned to record I Me Mine with George and Ringo, without John, who had left, and they even gave new mixes, but they still rejected the album proposal. Phil Spector, who would go on to a murder conviction, was enlisted to salvage the project and turn the recordings into an album, which became Let It Be. Just after John's shocking announcement, Paul was getting ready to end his relationship with McCartney. Paul has said that he notified his fellow Beatles previously about his decision to release McCartney, along with a press statement proclaiming his resignation from the Beatles in April 1970. The Beatles' next album was named after their March 1970 single, Let It Be, and it was scheduled to be released in May 1970, coinciding with the launch of the film. But Apple Records was anxious to avoid release conflicts, and Paul was hesitant to work with Apple because he didn't approve of Alan Klein, Paul's manager. So Ringo went to Paul's house with a letter from John and George asking Paul to delay the album's release. After Paul and Ringo got into a huge fight, Paul kicked the drummer out of his house. When asked about the disagreement, Chris Ingham of the Rough Guide to the Beatles said, "McCartney managed to retrieve his original release date, but when he heard what Spector had done to the Beatles' music, he hit the roof." Despite the album's release being the last act by the Beatles, not a single member of the band was present at the premiere. With John's departure from the Beatles a year earlier and Paul's first solo record out in April, it was clear that they had both moved on. When Paul released his first solo album, signaling the end of the Beatles, the world learnt of the band's breakup. Still, tensions within the band persisted.